This is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. It's fun to be looking out these windows at the beautiful San Francisco Bay. It isn't every day you can have lunch and watch boats sail around out in our beautiful 24-hour a day and 12 months a year access sailing venue. Lots of folks that go racing and will be out in the East Coast in a month recognize that winter is a time when you don't get to go sailing. It's just frostbiting. Not so for San Francisco. Our sailors get to race year-round and especially love our windy summers out here. So many of us who look out these windows see big tankers going back and forth. And remember that in the 50s, with the containerization of freight, there was a huge transformation in the cost of shipping. And it's continued to drop and drop and drop as ships that are 1,000 and more feet long carry up to 12,000, 20-foot equivalent containers. That cost of shipping dropping has meant that it's more and more efficient for export and import of traffic around the world, and it's enabled the global economy that we're living in right now. China has taken full advantage of that opportunity, building an incredible maritime force. And you might say, gee, that doesn't sound like battleships. That sounds like freights and liners. Yes, it is, but it's very, very significant. And our speaker today is going to talk a little bit about the national security implications of this transformation. He was born in San Francisco, a fourth-generation San Franciscan, to a maritime family. They originally sailed from Liverpool in the 1800s to Australia, and then a second generation sailed in 1851 with 3 ships from Sydney, Australia to San Francisco. Once they got here, they started selling hardware to the 49ers and became, an integral part of the San Francisco community. Our speaker went to SI, St. Ignatius in San Francisco, and then went to Kings Point Maritime Academy in New York, came back and went to Berkeley where he got a BA in linguistics. So he then went to the Army, spent 6 years as an active duty Army person and ascended to the rank of captain, went back to Europe for some more business in information technology and HR, and then came back here in 2009 to head a small private school, and they're now adding a campus in the Presidio in 2024. So he is a San Franciscan, and he does understand what we consider to be an incredibly important subject. So to speak about the U.S. Merchant Marine as a national security component, let's welcome Ben Harrison. Ben, come on up.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a lot of firsts for me today. I've never been live streamed on YouTube, and so I don't know if that's going to change my life or not, but young people I talk to in my other life running a school tell me that that's the way of the future. So this is how we all have to make our way now. So I guess today is the first day of the rest of my life. I appreciate you asking me here today to talk about this topic. It is not a topic that is widely discussed. It's going to, when we see the presentation and we see all the people that I'm going to show you who are talking about it, you may get the impression that everyone is talking about this. This is a big deal. It is not widely enough known what we're going to discuss today. A couple of years ago, I had an opportunity to get this topic in front of a recently retired Chief of Naval Operations. I thought it would be great to hear him talk about this. I could not get the question to him, and I don't think it's because he didn't want to talk about it. I think it's just the people who were filtering his questions had no idea what this is all about. It just seemed too strange, too far away from what anyone involved in the Navy would want to talk about. It wasn't about Top Gun, it wasn't about ships, it wasn't about war, it was about tankers and about container vessels. As we're going to hear today, there are a lot of people in the Navy talking about it. There are a lot of people in Congress and in the Senate talking about this. It's something that we should all be very concerned about, and so I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about it today. I am not the subject matter expert on this. I am an interested observer just sitting here for a half an hour, I realize I'm in a room with people who probably know a great deal more about these topics than I do. So I'm happy for this to be a conversation more than a lecture or a presentation. And I look forward to the Q&A at the end, and I expect I won't leave here today without learning something new myself. As a former military intelligence officer for a short time, not a long time, I am also interested in taking a look at things through the lens of intelligence analysis. Cynthia Graybo wrote a book with a very interesting title, a nice title, I call it a cute title, Anticipating Surprise. It's a little bit of an oxymoron. It has been, in the meantime, superseded by more recent scholarship, but she really talks about how to watch what people are doing and figure out what they intend to do. Building up military power is expensive, and there are better ways to stimulate an economy. So when someone is building up military power, it is with the intention of using it. This is Graybo's assertion, at any rate. Till the last 100 years or so, it was very easy to distinguish a military buildup from other kinds of national investment. Catapults don't have an obvious application in agriculture. War horses don't plow fields and pull carriages. When PCs hit the consumer market, though, in the 1970s, it took no time at all before we started to think up destructive uses for technology that was originally sold to play games and do our taxes. We live in an interconnected and interdependent world where data and goods can move from one place to another in seconds and days, not months and years. Everything humans do to survive is also a vulnerability. We need food, so if you can starve us out, we'll capitulate or die. We need shelter, so if you blow up our houses, we'll move or die. Or if you price shelter so high that we have to work and slave our whole lives just to afford it, that's what we'll do. Conflict between nations entails one nation trying to compel another nation to behave in a certain way. Normally, well, in the extreme, this involves literally enslaving your enemy, but sometimes it just involves compelling an adversary to organize their society, government, economy, or military in a way that benefits or at least does not threaten the victor. Just wiping everyone out is not usually in anyone's best interest. As we will hear today from a number of credible and thoughtful sources, China is developing capabilities that could be used to compel other nations, could be us, could be Finland, could be all of us, to organize our society, government, economy, or military along terms that they could dictate. We do that all the time to other nations. So why dismiss as fanciful or hyperbolic the notion that someone would try to do it to us? I see it less as sinister than as consequential. We have allowed ourselves to become highly dependent on things we don't make and can't get without the support and, in an increasing number of cases, without the permission of China. We've handed them the keys to our front doors, medicine cabinets, and pantries. We wanted them to water the plants and put away the Amazon deliveries while we've been on vacation for the last 50 years. Somewhere along the line, they got the impression we weren't coming home, and we have now gotten comfortable in the living room, done a bit of redecorating, and we hate to admit it, but they've even spruced the place up a bit. What we want to look at today is the awkward situation of how we get our keys and our living rooms back without causing a ruckus and waking up the neighborhood. I must point out that we're only touching the tip of an iceberg of issues here. I'm only focusing on maritime aspects. We're going to hear about the condition of our merchant marine. There are really two separate issues being discussed. They are often conflated because there's a huge amount of overlap in both the symptoms and the solutions, but for clarity, I want to give them some definition. One issue we will hear about is sea lift capability. In other words, our ability to get troops and equipment to overseas theaters of conflict, theaters of operation. This is a military necessity. If we tell some country, hey, you better not do that or else, and they know we can't get our or else to their doorstep, we have no conventional military credibility. The Brookings Institute report that I'll mention a bit later notes that by 2035, our sea lift capability will shrink to the point that the most we'll be able to deliver to a theater of operations is 70% of the equipment used by 3 Marine Corps expeditionary brigades. That's the sea lift issue. The other issue is commerce. During the recent pandemic and the so-called supply chain collapse, we experienced a little taste of what happens when there's a glitch in shipping. It was accidental, and everyone, including the Chinese, was anxious to unglitch it as quickly as possible. What if it weren't accidental, but deliberate and aggressive? In the spirit of never letting a good crisis go to waste, China took the opportunity to find out how much inconvenience and deprivation its citizens would put up with. It turns out they will put up with quite a bit. We, on the other hand, distributed stimulus checks to the tune of $814 billion. As a crisis response, I suspect our approach may not be sustainable. China's might be. I want to roll back the clock about 10 years, and we're going to hear from someone who is familiar probably to many of you in the room, our representative from California, John Garamendi, who is a great friend of the Merchant Marine. This is something he has been talking about for many years, tirelessly, relentlessly. He understands the issues. This is from 2014. It's very interesting. It's also interesting that when we look at 2023 and 2019, we'll see we haven't gotten too much farther. The issue of jobs in the maritime industry will come up. So just a couple statistics to keep in mind. In 2014, and it's about the same today, the maritime industry employs 260,000 Americans. There are $29 billion in wages and $100 billion in economic output. There are 12,800 professional, licensed, credentialed mariners in employment. 12,800. When he talks about, at the end, progress has been made, the topic of discussion here is a House Resolution 5270, the Growing American Ship Act, or the GAS Act, as he called it. That, as far as I know, went nowhere, but in the recent months, we've seen some more legislation that is at least addressing some of these issues in terms of the shipment of natural gas. So, here we go.
I'm excited about the potential that we have to really strengthen our maritime industry and to build the American economy and provide a significant number of jobs. The status of the U.S. Merchant Marine could not be a better topic for us to take up in the waning days of the 113th Congress. We've got a stretch run. Maybe we can get something done in the last couple of months of this session. Our merchant marine has been a fundamental element of our national defense and a key industry in our national economy since the founding of this republic more than 230 years ago. Unfortunately, recent history over the past 5 decades has not been very kind to our maritime industry. For example, the number of vessels serving the U.S. international trade has shrunk from 850 in the mid-1980s to roughly 90 vessels in 2014. Since 1983, the United States has lost approximately 300 shipyards, and only 10 shipyards are capable now of building large naval vessels and ocean-going commercial ships. Such losses are very disturbing. Nevertheless, despite the setbacks of the recent past and the ongoing challenges, a strong maritime foundation endures, especially in coast-wide trades that has remained protected under the Jones Act. And convinced now, more than ever, that with purposeful cooperation and action, our merchant marine can again flourish and resume its standing as a vital contributor to our national defense and economic might. Progress has been made.
Unfortunately, the progress that's been made has been more along the lines of 1 step forward and 2 steps back in the last 10 years. And Congressman Garamendi has made similar remarks over the last 10 years in a number of circumstances in front of Congress, at confirmation hearings. He's not a lone voice in the desert, but he is in a minority, I feel, in raising these issues. A couple of themes that we're going to hear a number of times repeated are these statistics the reduction in the number of ships, the mariner crisis or the mariner shortage. Something about counting ships is that you get a different number depending upon how you ask the question. So you're going to hear a lot of numbers bandied about. I've got some slides later on that will provide a little bit more transparency on that. The bottom line is that we don't have a lot of ships. The bottom line is that when you compare the number of ships flying under the U.S. flag to the number of ships flying under for private industry, for Maersk Line, for MSC, for Costco, for CMA CGM, they have ships in the 500, 600, 700s. We have ships in the under 100, depending upon how you count it, or up or less than 200 at the most. The highest number is about 180, 181. So just a fraction of what these private companies have. This is what this is about. Now, Senator Mark Kelly, who is also a graduate of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, class of 1986. I've got another picture of Mark Kelly following this slide. I don't know Mark Kelly personally, but I did meet him. The last time I met him, he threw my underwear at the wall as part of a little ritual. I was a plebe when he was a first classman. He was our regimental XO, and that was my encounter with Mark Kelly. He has gone on to great fame, of course, as an astronaut and now senator from Arizona. And as he will tell us right now, these issues concerning the maritime industry are also very important to him.
I want to talk about another issue. I'm the only graduate of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy in Congress, as far as I know. So I pay special attention to our nation's maritime strength. We talked a little bit about that when Senator Gillibrand asked her questions. And I'm concerned that the U.S. investment is falling dramatically behind what the Chinese government has invested in terms of the size and modernization of each of our respective merchant fleets. Since the 1980s, there have been a series of policy decisions that have brought us down to a rather startling figure of just 80 U.S.-flagged merchant vessels operating in international trade, and 60 of those consist of MARAD's Maritime Security Program that allows them to contract U.S.-flagged vessels during times of war. So we have 80 ships. The Chinese have over 5,500. And they're the world's top shipbuilder, and they control ports that handle 67% of the world's shipping containers. As you know well, this impacts our ability to supply our own troops in conflict. You talked about how much different the Western Pacific is from Europe. You know, islands, mobility, and logistical challenges. It also impacts trade and global supply chains in peacetime, and it's critical. I mean, this is the kind of capability that can't be turned on and off overnight. We need to invest now if we want to rely on it tomorrow. I know in your new role, there's a chance that you're going to need this capability. We also see some similar underinvestment in the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, which is under the Department of Transportation's purview, but it trains a lot of military officers and the mariners that'll man those ships. Our nation's national security leaders cannot turn a blind eye to these capabilities simply because they lie outside of the militaries and your immediate jurisdiction. And I think we really need to increase our focus here. So if confirmed, can I have your commitment to keep this concern top of mind as you enter into this new role as chairman?
Senator, if confirmed, you do have my commitment.
Thank you.
Okay, you heard General Brown, so now let's wait and see what happens. And you will notice we are now in the present day. This hearing was from a few weeks ago. These numbers are from a few weeks ago. A common theme that we're also going to hear today is this problem of turning it on like a spigot. We have the impression, historically, that we can do that because we did it in World War II, or at least it seemed like we did that in World War II. We had a conflict and we built a ton of ships and we manned those ships with mariners. Somehow we got it done. That is not going to be possible anymore. That we're too far away. Between World War I and World War II, we had a large shipbuilding industry, and we had a relatively large merchant marine. We don't have that anymore. If you think about how long it takes to get a license from the Coast Guard, how long do they always require? About 365 days to get a license. Is that because, why would that be? Because it takes a great deal of time and experience to develop the skills that you need to operate these vessels. This is not something that we can do overnight, and this is a theme that we'll hear brought up many times. I mentioned I knew Mark Kelly. I wanted to give you a little proof, a little show and tell here. There's Senator Kelly. He is second from the right, next to the fellow with shaving cream on his nose, who's being yelled at by a classmate of mine. And if you want an idea of how closely you get to know your friends at the Academy, the guy standing next to Nancy Reagan there, I recognize him from the back of his head. So that's how well you get to know each other. And a little more show and tell. This is me rolling the underwear. I'm not sure that this is the underwear that Mark Kelly threw at the wall, but this is just a little picture of what that ritual looks like. And one more piece of show and tell. This is when I was out at sea as a deck cadet, and I included that in case my wife showed up here today. I thought she would find it amusing to see me wearing that shirt, which is still in my closet. And one last, that's what eventually happened to me in the Army as an artillery officer and later intelligence officer. The Merchant Marine Academy has recently put out a very interesting video, which I encourage anybody to take a look at. It's easy enough to find online. I have a little snippet here from it, but what it also includes is a mention at the very end of the 142 Academy midshipmen, or cadets at the time, who were killed in action. The Merchant Marine Academy is the only federal academy whose students were sent into a war zone and were casualties. 142 college students were killed serving on ships in World War II. Most of them torpedoed, some of them killed by aircraft, some of them just sunk by mines. 142. That's a big number of college students. The Merchant Marine Academy is the only federal academy with a battle standard. And yet, the Merchant Marine Academy is the one no one's ever heard of.
During Operation Desert Storm, I was on an aircraft carrier. At the time, we had about 400 ocean-going merchant ships. And a lot of those weapons, weapon systems, munitions, fuel came on those merchant ships.
We've gone from a fleet of 2,900 ships in 1960 to today down to 182 ships. It is staggering and sobering as to where we are today, and we know the importance of logistics.
That's a problem. I mean, if we wind up in a conflict, and we want to do whatever we can to stay out of a conflict, especially with a near-peer adversary like China. But if we did find ourselves in a conflict on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, we have to be able to get the equipment and the people there that we need.
Today, we're in a much different environment, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, and the tyranny of distance in terms of just the length of a supply chain to getting people and equipment in there is so much longer and so much more precarious.
A major strategic problem that we face today is that the countries that we are at greatest odds with in Eurasia, that is to say Russia and Iran and China, are all seeking to project power outwards. And that involves naval conflict, and naval conflict requires resupply. Naval resupply constantly requires repairs, the material to conduct repairs with. All of that has to be borne by sea.
As they have constructed their merchant marine and financed it and supported it, is all focused on their ultimate effort. Which appears to be, of all outward appearances, at the very least, the reunification of Taiwan within People's Republic of China, but expansion of their influence around the world, both economically and militarily.
Maintaining an adequate number of U.S.-flagged merchant vessels and well-trained mariners is essential to national security.
And as our fleet has shrunk, so too has our pool of mariners. I testified on many occasions as the administrator that we were about 1,800 mariners short for a full-scale mobilization lasting more than about 6 months.
So if there were a conflict today, we could not just turn on a spigot and start producing more qualified merchant mariners. But sea lift is the backbone of our strategy of any power that has to use expeditionary forces in order to reach the places of conflict, and we're simply not ready.
We need that capability at sea. The ships are an important part of that, but the most important part of this renewed effort to make sure we have presence at sea is indeed our merchant mariners.
So we heard those themes again. Turning on the spigot. Can't just turn on the spigot. A term, the tyranny of distance. This is also one that comes up quite a bit. Only in science fiction have we overcome the tyranny of distance. Here, on this planet, that is a reality that is not going to go away anytime soon. We cannot just move quickly. It takes time to move a lot of equipment, it takes time to move a lot of people. That's the reality that we are dealing with. This is a tremendous vulnerability that we have. I mentioned that I am not the subject matter expert on these things, so I want to introduce you quickly to some of the people who are writing the most and thinking the most about this topic. And if you are interested in it, these are the people to look for. Dr. Salvatore Mercogliano, graduate of SUNY Maritime, Fort Schuyler, the New York State Maritime Academy, where, by the way, Mark Kelly's brother, Scott Kelly, also a Navy pilot, astronaut, went to school, graduated from. Salma Caruso has written a number of articles on this that are of great interest, mostly with regard to sea lift capabilities. Another gentleman who has written not only articles most recently in the Atlantic from a few months ago, but this little book that I have here, entitled Why Naval Primacy is America's First Best Strategy. It is probably the shortest and most poignant exposition of this topic. There is an interesting foreword by John Lehman, the 65th Secretary of the Navy, in here, where he says, "We need a new maritime strategy, and the strategy should provide broad guidance on what it seeks to accomplish to deter hostilities in the first place, but if that fails, to protect U.S. and allied forces, sink enemy combat and merchant fleets, and interdict and shut down their commerce." This is an interesting point. I don't want to go into this too much, but I think what we might be looking at here is a new kind of mutual assured destruction. Can we really sink enemy cargo ships? What are they carrying? They're carrying goods for Walmart. They're carrying baby formula that we need. I'm not sure that this is really the solution. Another report that just came out from the Brookings Institute, also and just very recently, refers to protecting the logistics muscle from atrophy. Again, making the point that if we are not actively engaged in maritime commerce, we cannot just turn it on when we happen to need it for national defense. This has to be something that we're doing all the time. I was recently in Greece. Greece has the largest fleet. They have the most tonnage in the world. Well, it seems like everyone in Greece knows something about ships. They know something about the water. They know something about boating. This is just part of their DNA, and it makes sense. We're a maritime nation also. We've got the third largest coastline in the world. This is something that we need to get back into our DNA. The Brookings Institute article talks about this. And lastly, John Conrad, also a graduate of SUNY Maritime, lives in California now. He is the founder and editor of G Captain, which is an online blog. I'm sure you've seen articles from there. He recently, well, a few years ago, he wrote this article and then recently republished it, Admiral, I Am Not Ready for War, talking about the training that mariners have and the deficiencies of those training if mariners were sent into harm's way, if they were sent into conflict zones. And one of the points that he makes, get this back up here, okay. One of the points that he makes is that merchant mariners, they're not veterans, they don't work for the federal government, they don't receive benefits. If you may recall that the Merchant Marine was not given veteran status until 1988, 40 years after the Second World War, despite the fact that the Merchant Marine had, by percentage, more casualties than any other armed service. This is also a problem. This is a problem if we were to ask merchant mariners today to go back into harm's way. How many of them would go? Okay. I'm going to skip over a few slides here. This is an article that I wrote myself, which you can look up online, covering many of these topics, but more concerned with the commercial aspects. Okay. The last fellow that we want to hear from again is Rear Admiral Mark Busby. He is the former Maritime Administrator. He was nominated as the Administrator in 2017 and resigned in 2021, along with Elaine Chow. The current Maritime Administrator is Rear Admiral Ann Phillips, but Admiral Busby had quite a bit to say about this also as a Merchant Marine Academy graduate. I'm not going to go through all the slides that I have because we are running out of time and I want to allow enough time for questions, but let's hear from him once.
Talk about the role of the organization in a great power context.
Yeah, well, thanks, Vago, for asking and for being with you. It's key. It's absolutely key. You know, sea power, as Mahan has told us, is not just navies. It's the commercial merchant marine as well. Both parts of it are necessary for a nation to be a great sea power. And I think we still fancy ourselves a great sea power. So, you know, we've potentially over the last few years gotten a little bit out of balance. We still have the greatest Navy in the world, but our commercial merchant marine, that part of it has kind of gone fallow a bit. You know, we're down to 81 U.S. internationally trading ships in this world, which is what our commerce supports right now. You know, we need to do better than that. Our presence in the world suffers as a result of having so few ships.
I've actually got quite a bit more from Admiral Busby that I'm going to spare you, but you can find all of this and you'll see the Navy. He's speaking at a Navy League event there, and I know we have the Navy League represented here. So we're all family. I wanted to kind of cut to the end and talk about solutions. One of the predictions for the future, going out till 2040, is that we could end up in a situation where supply chains have become so frustrated that we return to a sort of isolationism here in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, where we are pretty much just supplying our own needs domestically. That's one option. If we can't move goods anymore, or if it's too dangerous for others to move goods for us. This is a question I'm often asked, by the way, which is, well, all these goods are moving on the ships of our friends. They're moving on Danish ships. They're moving on Swiss ships. They're moving on French ships. These are our friends. These are our allies. Why would they stop moving our goods? Well, no one's threatening to sink them right now if they come to our ports. If all of a sudden the waters get hot, we might find that our friends are not as willing to put their ships in harm's way as we might like. So one alternative is that we simply return to isolationism. Another alternative is that we reduce our addiction to foreign import. We just start producing things ourselves. Either of these is beginning to look a lot more like wartime deprivation, right? We would not be getting the VCRs. We would not be getting the chips. We would be sharing eggs from our neighbors' chickens. That's an alternative, though. It can be done. The third option is that we can try to compete with China for dominance of the high seas. Option 3 would require a conscious national will to change the current regulatory and employment environment that makes building, owning, and operating ships under the U.S. flag outrageously prohibitive and unprofitable. Okay? It is not so much that we prevent shipbuilding and that we prevent ship ownership. It's just that it is so much more attractive to do it under foreign flags and with foreign mariners. If we want to exercise option 3, we need to change that. We would have to also heavily subsidize the maritime industry. I have a somewhat radical suggestion, which is where I'm going to conclude this presentation, for how we can revitalize mariner recruiting and get the merchant marine up and running again. Some of the presentations that I didn't show you are from the current Maritime Administrator, Ann Phillips, who makes the point that it doesn't do any good to train a lot of mariners if they don't have ships to sail on. Those skills atrophy very, very quickly. Some of the other presentations, you would hear the number 1,800 bandied about. Admiral Busby mentions it for the first time in 2019, but we're still talking about that number. 1,800 is how many mariners we're short. Well, the Federal Academy, Kings Point, and the 6 state academies in California, Maine, Massachusetts, Texas, Michigan, and New York, they graduate 1,400 mariners every year. So in less than 2 years, we could make up that shortage. How come we're not? How come in 2017 we were missing 1,800? In 2019 we were missing 1,800? In 2023 we're still 1,800 short, even though we're graduating 1,400 mariners every year? There's no ships for them to sail on. We don't have a merchant fleet under U.S. flag. This is the problem. My somewhat radical suggestion is this. We federalize the merchant marine. Mariners become permanent federal employees with veterans benefits, special privileges, government health care, retirement pay, all of those things that Captain John Conrad tells us are impediments to recruiting mariners. Mariners get paid a lot more than soldiers and sailors, so use the GS pay scale to more closely approximate current average mariner income. Now, some might say that's going to be too expensive, so let's do a little back of the napkin math. We heard there were 12,800 licensed mariners. We need 1,800 more, so 12,800, that's about a little short of 14,000. If we paid each of them $100,000 a year, we're looking at about $1.5 billion. Let's pay them all $200,000 a year. Now we're looking at about $3 billion. We gave out $814 billion in COVID relief. Is it really too expensive? The ships that we need to get up to the number just required for sea lift will cost us $25 billion over 10 years. $25 billion. We gave out $814 billion in about a year. Are these costs really that unreasonable? The U.S. Maritime Service, which is part of MARAD, would take over mariner training and licensing from the Coast Guard. This would give mariners steady employment with relatively predictable working conditions. Rather than sitting in union halls wondering where your next job is going to come from, you know where your next job is going to come from. Now, a little bit more radical is ship owners. If people started owning ships again in the United States, ship owners could provide the ships, and the Maritime Service could provide the crews. This gets around a lot of the regulatory problems that we have and the employment problems that we have. If the mariners are not working directly for the companies. And lastly, this gives us the potential for an actual reserve component, just like the National Guard or the Army Reserve or the Navy Reserve, where people train several times a year and can keep their skills current. We don't have anything like that right now for the Merchant Marine, unless sailors pay for that themselves out of their own pocket or their unions pay for it. So this is my radical solution. It would not go down well probably with unions, although I'm not suggesting that we put the unions out of business. I'm simply suggesting that we offer mariners another option for employment, which would be a federalized merchant marine. So with that, I'm concluding these remarks, and I'm anxious to start the Q&A, the conversational part of this, because I'm sure you're going to have some real stumpers for me. Okay.
Ben, great talk. Thank you. So give us a quick summary, merchant fleet size by nation.
By nation, a quick summary. Well, like I said, it's anytime you start counting ships, it's a little like trying to count fleas. I don't have it by nation.
China's number one. How big is theirs?
According to Senator Kelly, yes, China is number one at 5,500. Those are not going to all be container ships and tankers, because the Chinese have federalized a lot of their civilian, what we would call a civilian fleet. Even to the point of putting yachts and tugboats and things under federal control in China. So this, of course, increases their numbers. But a lot of that is cargo capacity, tankers and container ships. Greece, of course, has quite a bit as well. Many of those ships are chartered out to other companies to operate, including to U.S. companies.
So you're saying China's number one, Greece is number two. Just give us a quick summary. Are
Actually,
we number 5, number 3? Where are we?
Oh, we're not even in the top 10. So Greece is definitely number one, and we're pretty far down. We're not top 10.
Now, America only represents 6% of the world population, yet because we sit atop a self-constructed, we constructed pyramid of alliances, we are more powerful. So if you took a look at all of our partners' ships, how big of a force are we compared to China from that perspective?
You mean if we
add together,
their
America's ships, England's ships, Japan's ships, Germany's ships, all of our alliance partners, do we come closer to parity in that game?
Certainly, yes. Absolutely.
Okay. Or do we exceed China on that measure?
Yes, I would say so, yes.
Okay. And so, essentially, now let's get back to the key question that you raised. Why is it that America's maritime force has shrunk so much? Give it to us in a few short sentences. Is it domestic laws that we created? Is it apparent lack of what we thought was demand? Why did we shrink so much?
So there are a variety of opinions on this. In recent testimony, current Maritime Administrator Ann Phillips said it was historical, that after World War I and after World War II, we simply sold off or got rid of the ships that we had built for the conflict. I don't agree with that. I don't think that that's what happened after World War II at all. Immediately following World War II, we had the world's largest merchant marine. What happened was regulation. What happened was employment laws that simply made it prohibitive to flag ships under the U.S. flag and made it much more attractive to flag foreign or to give ships, to sail ships under a foreign flag.
So I want to take a moment to acknowledge the Navy League. The Navy League is very supportive of the St. Francis Yacht Club Speaker Series. In fact, you're one of many speakers of maritime interest that have come to us because of the Navy League. We have the president of the local chapter, Angus Blackwood here, essentially Pakistone here, and we also have the president of the Jeremiah O'Brien Foundation here, Forrest Booth, and so in both cases, I want to thank you guys for helping us constantly keep a fresh crop of speakers on these very, very important topics coming to our stage. When you think about what entities are supporting a buildup of American maritime forces, where do you look for from support? That's one question. And two, which politicians understand the importance of this topic?
Well, certainly the politicians that we've heard from today, John Garamendi, Mark Kelly, a number of others. This is not unknown to them, but it is not something that is very popular with the voters. It sounds like a lot of bad news, so it's not too surprising that this is not front page. However, it will be when we did have the pandemic and those ships started piling up in Long Beach and in Oakland. For a lot of people, that was the first time that they'd seen cargo ships. You have to stack them up for people to notice them. Well, that can happen again. In terms of industry, how do we rebuild the maritime industry? I think we simply have to incentivize American companies to build and own ships. We have to do it. The margins for shipping are notoriously small. It has to be subsidized. China is not doing this because it's a moneymaker. China is doing it because it's a national defense priority. We need to have the same priority.
Now, I'm going to keep asking questions, but if you have a question in the audience, raise your hand and the mic will come to you. We have one online. John, have you got the question online that came through the chat? And by the way, if you're watching via the YouTube live stream, you can put questions in the chat box and we'll ask them here to our speaker. John?
We have a question from David James. He says, has the Jones Act been good for the U.S. Merchant Marine?
The Jones Act has been good for a portion of the Merchant Marine, specifically the Jones Act lines, so cargo that travels between U.S. ports. If it weren't for the Jones Act, the few shipbuilding yards that we have now probably would not even exist.
Can you give a quick top line, short paragraph on what is the Jones Act?
So the Jones Act, or the Merchant Marine Act, it's relatively short. At least my understanding of it, it says the United States needs to have a merchant marine. The United States needs to have a merchant marine manned by American mariners. That the Navy is responsible for. That's the Mahan Doctrine. There's no Navy component in the Jones Act. That cargo between American ports must be carried on Navy ship. That government cargo needs to be carried on American-built and crewed ships.
So to give us some context, how big was the Merchant Marine at the beginning of World War I, at the end of World War I, and then beginning World War II and into World War II?
I don't have those numbers. Certainly bigger than it was now. Ships were also much smaller, though. This is something that we have to keep in mind. We're building ships today that are 10 to 20 times the size of cargo ships and tankers even 50 years ago. So it required a lot more mariners and a lot more ships to move much less cargo, relatively speaking. However, that meant we had a lot of trained mariners. This brings up another issue, which is if waters were to become contested in the next 10, 20, 30 years, does it really make sense to have ships that are so big? One torpedo will sink a big ship as quickly as it will sink a small ship, except there's a lot more cargo and value that goes to the bottom with those big ships. I would not say that that there's any sinister motivation in building ships larger and larger and larger. That has to do with economies of scale. However, these super large ships do constitute an increased vulnerability in contested seas.
Speaking of our valuable Navy League, the President, Angus, has a question.
Well, first, Ron, let me say I owe you a glass of Chardonnay for giving a plug for the Navy League. And actually, my question...
I'm a red wine kind of guy.
Pinot Noir. Actually, my question was on the Jones Act, and the person online asked the question. So let me just say that the Navy League of the United States strongly supports the Jones Act. But I do recognize there's always two sides of a debate. But I want to ask you, is there, as part of our strategy, is there a certain Hail Mary where there's a conscription element where we seize ships in port or within our control and make them part of our fleet? And also, can you give us how much sea lift capability has changed since Desert Storm? When we think of Desert Storm, moved a couple 100,000, maybe closer to 500,000 troops, mainly through air. A lot of the equipment was already forward deployed. So if you could maybe discuss that a little bit.
Sure. Okay. So on the first point, and it's a point that Captain John Conrad raises in the article that I talked about. We don't like to talk about it, but yes, if we needed to, we would seize every ship in every U.S. port and use it. Great, but we've got no one to crew the ships. We can't compel foreign mariners to operate those ships for us. We can take the bottoms, but we can't crew them. So this is a problem there. But yes, we could. There are also a great many ships owned by American companies, but foreign flagged. Part of what Admiral Busby talks about is incentivizing American companies to reflag their ships under the U.S. flag. We have to create conditions that make it attractive to do so, but if they did, then they would have American mariners sailing. The trained mariners that we're putting out every year, the 1,400 that are graduating every year, give them jobs and keep those skills fresh. I'm sorry, the second question.
Airlift versus prepositioning.
Right. So, going into Desert Storm, we had good military sea lift capability. Good enough. Not excessive, but it was good enough. And I believe the numbers are mentioned in the Brookings Institute article that we had, is it 11 million square feet of cargo capacity, which is enough. So 1 million square feet of cargo capacity, if I'm getting my numbers right, 1 million is enough to move 70% of one Marine Corps expeditionary brigade. So we had 11 million of those, and as I mentioned in the talk, by 2035 we're projected to have only 3 million of those. So far down from the 11. The 11 million that we had was enough to move the equipment that we needed for Desert Storm.
Another question from the Navy League. Perfect.
Thank you, Ben, for your great presentation. You've really, I think, instructed us all in the nuances of and importance of this topic. What I wanted to ask you about was part of the contributing factors as to why we have approximately 80 ships today, down from the scores more that America used to occur and have. Is it in part due to the fact if we were here today at the St. Francis Yacht Club and watching a ship go out, it's highly likely that the carrier would be not an American carrier and also a company that's not an American-based firm? Is it a contributing factor that got us to this situation, the fact of all the mergers and acquisition activity that happened here in America with organizations and companies that used to be American-based that are no longer? I mean, I know your father at one time led a company that I believe doesn't exist any longer because of an M&A condition. Could you give us some color on that?
So the question is, has the roll-up in the maritime industry diminished America's dominance at sea? If I got that.
I think it's the other way around, actually, Ed. I think it's we lost dominance, and then it was easy pickings for foreign companies to take over American President lines and Sealand and Likes lines and Waterman. All of the, I mean, there were dozens of American shipping companies even 50 years ago, and the fact that we simply stopped crewing them and stopped operating them made it easy to be taken over. We had the lines; these companies had the trade routes, and so that's what was really acquired was the trade routes and the ships themselves. But ships have a limited shelf life.
Another question from the audience. Forrest Booth, president of the Jeremiah O'Brien Foundation. I think it's on, Forrest.
There we go. Thanks. You mentioned subsidies, and there used to be CDS and ODS. The government had a program called Construction Differential Subsidy and Operational Differential Subsidy. And those became phenomenally expensive, and eventually they were more or less trimmed back and then done away with. Do you think that that is feasible, just given what the cost would be and the cost differential, putting aside whether there are enough shipyards to build ships? But do you think the government can actually subsidize either of those enough to make a difference?
Well, yes, but it would be painful. I think Mark Busby comes at a figure of, I think he said $5.6 million is the differential between building a ship in the U.S. and one that's built in a foreign port. I think that's the number that he came up with, and that's based on the just on the subsidies. Higher than that, you think? Okay, well, I believe it. Now the subsidies, where do they go in terms of shipbuilding? Yes, building ships is very important. Is very expensive in the United States. Why is that? Well, OSHA. There's again regulation. There's I'm certainly not suggesting that we make shipbuilding or sailing dangerous again, like it has been in the past. But there's regulation that's useful, and then there's regulation that's just regulation. And I believe strongly that in shipbuilding and in the maritime industry in the United States, the regulation has gotten to the point where it's simply too expensive. And that's, if we could solve that, then the subsidies could certainly come down.
So, Navy man, lawyer, diplomat, author, Bruce Janagian has a question.
Thank you very much. We often hear the reason for our relationship with China being that we support an open and free Indo-Pacific. Now, could you elaborate on what an open and free Indo-Pacific means? If it's what I think it means an open and free Indo-Pacific for Chinese shipping to proceed as it has been proceeding, and that we're going to confront China to keep Chinese shipping free and open.
Well, okay, I'm getting a little bit out of my depth here with that. I'm not an expert on national security. I do know that I think a few days ago the Chinese were down around the Philippines shooting water cannons at some Philippine ships trying to resupply about 12 Philippine Marines on a little stretch of sand 1,100 miles away from China. So the Chinese definitely have a very, very expansive view of where they can operate, what their backyard is. And I think the United States wants to operate the same way in the Pacific. That's pretty much all I can say about that.
So there's been a lot written lately about island building in the South China Sea and their interest in creating a kind of peripheral, chain of islands to protect what they consider to be, their maritime lanes. Talk a little bit about what they're doing there and the national security implications for the rest of the world.
This is out of my depth. This is not something that I'm watching. That's
no pun intended on the depth.
But it's definitely an issue. The Mahan Doctrine, which if you're familiar with the Mahan Doctrine, which I was first introduced to at the Merchant Marine Academy as a plebe, basically states that if you don't control your own seas, somebody else will. And the recipe for world power is dominance over shipping, over sea lanes, commercial and military. It's very, very important. And this is what the Chinese are attempting to do. I think it's fairly clear that they're operating according to a fairly traditional interpretation of the Mahan Doctrine. They're simply trying to ensure that their ships can go anywhere they want to go, unharassed, unfettered, unencumbered. We want to do the same thing, although part of the Mahan Doctrine for us entails that the Navy has to make it possible. Merchant ships don't have guns. The Navy has to keep the sea lanes open. The Navy has to ensure that our commerce can flow. This is a big task for the Navy. If you've, another Tom Hanks movie that came out a couple years ago, it was terrific, showing how difficult it is to convoy a bunch of merchant ships, especially when you've got submarines out there trying to pick them off. Well, that aspect probably hasn't changed a lot. It's work intensive, it's labor intensive, it's resource intensive, and it's not very glorious. So it's not the kind of mission that the Navy is going to jump over any more than the Air Force liked having to do close air support with A-10s. This is not what is going to gain you, rank and fame in these services, but it is a very, very important task. The Chinese are doing it. They have that of those 5,500 ships that they have. They're including the Navy ships that are out making sure that their commerce can flow. It's all one team. This is the piece that we're not quite getting right here in the United States.
Wait, you said the 5,500 count of Chinese ships includes some of which are military commerce ships, or do you just mean that some are privately owned by companies and some are owned by the government? Which do you mean?
Okay, again, I'm not sure where Senator Kelly got 5,500 from, although that sounds like the right number. So that may or may not include the PLA Navy. But the PLA Navy is very much involved in protecting Chinese shipping.
Just like our Navy is engaged in protecting our shipping.
Recently, yes, we've had. Now we heard about them putting Marines on ships in the Persian Gulf, I think, to protect them. This should be a normal role for the Navy, but it is not one that has been embraced, let's say, in the last 20 to 30 years.
Lance Berg has a question. Lance.
So there's no question that a nation of our size with our amount of manufacturing and export should have a robust merchant marine in order to take our goods overseas. As I'm not a subject matter expert here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, consolidation in the overseas cargo industry has gotten to the point where there are now 4 major conglomerates of container shipping in the world. There's a European one that's led by Maersk and CMA CGM and Zim and a few others. There's a Japanese that's run by NYK and 3 other lines. There's a Korean conglomerate that's Mitsubishi, or not Mitsubishi, it's Hyundai and some others. And then there's, of course, the Chinese. 3 of those 4 are actually run by rampantly capitalistic societies. And they've been able to maintain robust and active and competitive merchant marine for overseas cargo distribution. What is it that they did right that we need to do so that we can also have such robust capability? Is it that we should join one of those? Is there something about their legislation so wrong in ours? Speak a little about what those other capitalist areas, not about the Chinese. What did they do so well?
Thanks for the good question.
Well, that is the perfect question. I mean, that's the $20,000 question here, because Maersk Line, Hapag-Lloyd, CMA CGM, French, MSC, Swiss, their crews are safe, they're well paid, they're happy, they're not having trouble finding people to crew their ships. So what is it that they're doing? It's not necessarily the case that they're just paying people in rice. They are paying well. They have good conditions. I've been on Hapag-Lloyd ships and they're beautiful. I mean, the crew lives in a little bit of luxury on a merchant ship. Not that ours were terrible, but they're very nice. So I believe that it's the margins, it's economics, it's the regulatory environment, and it's the fact that it's just too expensive it's more expensive to crew ships with U.S. mariners because of the unions, but also because of the regulatory and legal environment.
So the United States has a GDP of 23 trillion, and China's is 18 trillion, Japan's is 5 trillion. If all shipping stopped tomorrow, which of those economies would be most damaged?
that mutual assured destruction I mentioned works both ways. I believe that China would be tremendously damaged if commerce stopped tomorrow. So they would certainly be shooting themselves in their own foot. What I believe they've demonstrated is that's something that they can put up with.
So my question next is, world trade seems to be linked more and more in our economy to world peace. You don't tend to want to shoot your customers. We're their biggest customer. So it would seem like a self-defeating proposition to basically, hurt our economy and hurt our citizenry, since we'd stop buying their products and their economy would collapse more rapidly.
Which is why they wouldn't want to do that. That's
right.
Quite correct. The goal of maritime siege warfare is not the destruction of your enemy. It's the capitulation of your enemy. You get them to do what you want them to do, the way you want them to do it. If you are in control of the flow of goods to the point that you could say, well, if you want your baby formula, if you want your chips, if you want your fuel, if you want any of these things, if you want your VCRs and your TVs, you've got to play by our rules. Then you've achieved what you want. This, I think, is the realistic threat that we face.
What's the build time of a modern container ship? Is it 1 year cycle, 2 year cycle?
No, I think it's less than that. I think you can build a container ship in about 6 months in a shipyard that is doing a lot of it.
So I remember this tale that Henry Kaiser went to Roosevelt before World War II and said, we're going to need a Navy because we're going to go to war, and we need to build lots of ships, especially merchant ships, to engage in that war. And Roosevelt said, yeah, but you don't build ships. And he said, no, but I can build shipyards. And we then rapidly built an incredible number of ships in a very short few years. In fact, this Bay Area became the most productive shipbuilding area in all of history, in any region in all of history. The Jeremiah O'Brien was built in Richmond and so on. So is there a Henry Ford around, or if we had to build ships quickly, who would we go to? Who would do that?
Well, that's a good question. Could we do it? I've heard a number of these speakers in Congress say, we can't do it anymore. We don't have the skills anymore to do that. We have to develop the skills, and then we'd have to do enough of it to retain those skills. In World War II, when we were building those ships, it was mostly manual. The professional skills were the naval architects and the engineers, but the bulk of the manpower or woman power at the time was manual labor. That is going to be less the case now, where a lot of it is going to be done by automation, but we're going to need more, which is good, right? I mean, we may not need hundreds of thousands of people to do it, but putting in the automation and building these shipyards is now a much more complicated task than it was 70, 80 years ago.
So Ben Harrison, thank you very much for bringing this incredible subject to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. You brought a series of really powerful questions and some thought-provoking solutions. Thanks so much for being our guest.
Thank you, Ron. It was my pleasure.
Good discussion. Great questions. Thank you, everybody. Good going.
That was Stump the Jump.
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.